poor man's clapper. And it is my pleasure to introduce Bob Berry, who has been retained by U.S. Term Limits to promote U.S. Term Limits. And he's had spoken to us once before in the other room, talking to us about Bitcoin. This one will be equally as enchanting as the last one. I really enjoyed the last one. You were a great speaker, so please don't disappoint me.
I won't, I promise. So before I begin, I want to pass this around kind of while I'm talking, and I'm going to come back to this. So if you guys wouldn't mind just kind of sending that thing around, and I'll say a few words about that. Let me get my notes here. Alrighty. So, it's been a little over 2 years since I was here, and that was the talk I gave about cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, and of course it was out there, so I had to kind of fight the the crowd a little bit, but it was a lot of fun, and it was a really good, engaging talk. I really enjoyed that time with you guys. How many of you, I know at least a couple, I know Liberty Bill was here. Who was here for that one? Who remembers that talk? Oh, so, okay, yeah, okay, wow, so good number of you, okay. So, at that time, that subject was about a year old to me, and so I'd spent a good part of that year kind of learning about it. It's one of these things where you kind of go down the rabbit hole on these things, and you learn more and more. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be in the same category. And I'm going to give you a couple things. I'm going to make a lot of observations, but I'm also going to give you a few things that you're going to want to learn about after today, and a few things you're going to want to keep an eye on, and even a couple things that you're probably or hopefully going to want to do. Okay, so the talk that I like to give, and every one of my talks, I do a lot of public speaking, I do a lot of radio and things like that, and I usually tailor my remarks to not only the group that I'm talking to, but also kind of the mood I'm in. And so I've been in this kick lately about reinvention. So I've titled this talk "Reinventing Us," and so us could be you and me, but it can also be the U.S. And one of the things I always like to point out is that, and I'm very careful whenever I'm invited to go on radio. Sometimes I'm invited on, and somebody says, hey, this happened in Congress today. This is terrible. We're furious about this. Why don't you come on and help us rail about this thing that happened in Congress today, or happened in the legislature today? And I universally refuse those invitations. And the reason I do is because I prefer to talk about solutions. I do not like to go and just pile on and talk about, oh, isn't this terrible? Isn't this awful? I want to be about solutions. And I think it's really important that we preserve our uniquely American attribute, which is optimism. And when I say optimism, I'm not saying optimism for the sake of being optimistic. I think people are kind of wired one way or another. I think I'm naturally an optimistic person, but I don't want to be a Pollyanna. I want to be positive because I want to accomplish something. I want to do, and you win more. You're just more influential when you have something to look forward to. When you're saying, hey, this is something we can do, rather than just kind of cursing the darkness. So what I want to talk about, when I talk about reinventing, this goes from the individual, maybe our companies, all the way to our country. And so everybody at some point, if you're a sufficient age, has been at some point in your life where you've gone through the ringer, and you just need to come out the other end one way or another, and you need to reinvent yourself. And one of the reason I kind of say this is kind of an American quality is Americans very uniquely are very, very comfortable with this idea of reinvention. We tend to be unconventional. And really unconventional in business, unconventional in warfare. My father used to tell me stories, a World War II vet used to tell me stories about how the Germans went nuts trying to figure out how we could lose our chain of command and still be able to press the attack. It's because we were people who took the initiative. We reinvented the attack. We came at a different angle. They didn't know what to make of us. If we disrupted their chain of command, they were standing around wondering what to do next. And this is a lot of the people we fought. We do this in business all the time. We'll press an attack in one area competitively. Somebody will counter that, and will come out of nowhere with a completely new business and a new business idea. This is an American spirit we need to tap into, really, to move forward. So my thinking is I talk a lot about the future, and sometimes people ask me, do I consider myself a futurist? And I just was caught cold by this question. I thought, that's kind of cool. Yeah, I'd kind of like to be. I said, well, I'm kind of maybe like a near futurist. Maybe a near futurist. I heard some time ago that people who are in the business of predicting, they go and they look at their predictions, and what is universally seems to be the case is that we underestimate predictions in the short term. I'm sorry, we overestimate predictions in the short term. We underestimate them in the long term. And I kind of look back over things that I've talked about in the past, and I'm guilty in that area. I tend to overestimate things in the short term and underestimate or just don't even go there in the long term.
Do you want to take comments in the middle, or do you want?
I want to save questions. I'm going to create some pauses for some interaction. So we'll kind of save questions for a little bit, and yeah, if you have something you'd like to say, please pipe in. So anyway, so I'm looking at a couple things, and I'm saying, I heard some years ago the best way to predict the future is to invent it, and that kind of goes along with this theme of reinventing us. And I want to kind of highlight a couple things just to kind of give us an idea where I'm going with this thing. I want to talk about BlackBerry and Apple. So we're coming up. 2007 was when the first iPhone came out, and prior to that time, the hands down market leader, and a lot of us had these things, right? These BlackBerry devices, that had your thumbs going like crazy. And by 2007, you had several other makers of that class of product. You had, Palm. You had all these different things. And what was happening is those, competition is good, but nobody was really innovating in the space. They were pretty much coming in with Me Too products. The margins were going down to single digits, and here they are fighting over single digits. Apple comes in. They didn't invent the smartphone, but they really popularized it. They were the ones who created a whole ecosystem around it. And their margins, when they came in with the iPhone in 2007, within a couple of years or so, they really kind of took over that market. Their margins were something like in the 70s. And this is the example of innovation that we see, right? And so if you understand the free market economies, the way they work is you're competing, you always have to be innovating as part of your competitive thing. It's not just a matter of getting your costs under control, it's also pressing that innovation, always reinventing yourself, always doing something new. And to the extent that that was not being done in the prior space, their margins were going to zero and eventually would have gone negative, and very badly went negative after Apple came out with this device. We've seen this again and again, and this is always the free market kind of saying, if you are profitable, if you innovate, the free market is saying, well done, good and faithful servant, right? You've used land, labor, and capital efficiently. You've created something wonderful that people want to voluntarily part with their money for, and they're going to buy this thing. So we're going to reward you with something called a profit, right? And the profit, you can either take a bath in it, you can distribute it to your shareholders, or you can reinvest it and see if you can continue this role that you're on. Okay, the flip side of that, of course, is the loss. The loss is saying, you evil company, you have taken land, labor, and capital, you have not executed, you've not provided a product that you can deliver profitably, so you've squandered these resources, so nature is going to decimate you slowly and over time, and if you do not get this thing right, you are going to be non-existent. Okay, this is the market is ruthless like this. I one of my favorite economists is Walter Williams. And Walter Williams has a funny thing that he talks about. He says we don't really think about this very often, but consumers are very ruthless. He says, if I go to my grocer and he doesn't have milk when I need it, if he hasn't anticipated my need for milk before I knew I needed milk, I'm going to fire him as my grocer. This is the standard that we hold people to in the market. Of course, this is how markets become ever more efficient. So we see this kind of ruthless consumer demand saying, hey, we want you to delight us, we want you to amaze us, give us fantastic products. And of course, it's a challenge to be able to do that. You don't want to be, if you're a company or an individual, you don't want to sit on your laurels and say, gee, the profits keep rolling in, I'm just going to sit here. You end up being a Kodak or something like that. So the other thing that occurs to me is one of the things I learned in business schools, is kind of funny, is this the saying, kill the cash cow. So if you're in a business and you've got a profitable enterprise and somebody in your group comes up with an idea, but that idea affects the cash cow of your business, and Kodak is really a classic example of this thing. They missed all of the modern age of digital photography because they were stuck in this film mentality, and they weren't open to what was coming next. And as a result of that, it ended up basically being the end of them. they are, they're non-existent, and nobody cares. Nobody cares at all. So the reason I make these points is because if we are not continually innovating as a people, as a company, as a country, we will be left behind in history. And this is where I get to the big caution of the day. And this is especially poignant today, because if you watch the news, you see we got this gigantic hurricane coming in. And so this reminds me of a trip that I took with my kids back in 2005. In August 2005, I happened to be visiting Seattle with my 2 children. And this was when Hurricane Katrina was coming in from the Gulf of Mexico. And I remember in the hotel lobby, they had this gigantic television set, and they had this this image on the screen. This hurricane was so huge and it was so menacing. I think it was like 200-mile-an-hour winds. It was bigger than this one they're talking about in Florida right now. And it was coming right at New Orleans. And so we assumed, what everybody assumed, was that people in New Orleans were getting the hell out of New Orleans, right? That's a pretty reasonable assumption. We found out later that really most of them didn't. Now, I think that's a lesson we've learned, right? So I think in Florida, people are getting out of harm's way. But for some reason in New Orleans, they did not do this. And I think what this is a classic example of is something called normalcy bias. Have you ever heard this term, normalcy bias? Okay, so this is where you more or less think the status quo is going to be okay, everything's going to be fine, everything's going to remain normal, and it causes you to not pay attention to impending disasters. Okay, so I think that lesson's been learned. I hope that lesson's been learned. It was a really tough lesson to learn, but there are other kinds of hurricanes that come along. There are financial hurricanes, there are political hurricanes, and so part of what I want to talk about is I want us to kind of open our eyes a little bit. I want us to step out of normalcy bias, and I want us to look at where our trend lines are taking us right now. Okay, we have always prized ourselves on being a government of laws and not of men. And that is increasingly, this is kind of the bad news part of the talk, that is increasingly not the case. We are becoming a government of cronies. If I'm a lobbyist in 9 states, registered lobbyist in 9 states. I lobby for one issue and one issue only, and that is this idea of an amendments convention under Article 5 of the Constitution, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit in a minute. And so, you see these lobbyists, and you see the deal that they have with these legislators, and this is both at the state level and the federal level. And you see some degree of cronyism going on, where the fix is constantly in, where the system becomes completely corrupt. And when I say corruption, let me be really specific about this. I'm talking about institutionally corrupt. I'm talking about, yes, maybe some direct, absolute payoff kind of stuff, go to jail kind of corruption. But I'm also talking about kind of the corruption of power and this Faustian bargain that a lot of elected officials have with lobbyists and with special interests, where it's basically, you take care of me in the next election, and I'll take care of you when it comes time to supporting your bill. And then the lobbyists go into work, and the job as a lobbyist is you have your client, and you go to your elected officials, and you say, I want you to make my client's products mandatory, and their competitors' products illegal, or somewhere on that scale. And so this is a different way to make money rather than the free market way that I was talking about earlier, right? So we have the free market way, and that is all entirely dependent on a free exchange of goods, right? But when you bring government into the play, and they can have coercive power, you destroy the free market. And if you love the free market, if you love the kind of innovations that we talk about that get us excited, and you watch this machine just chew into the free market, continually distorting it, you lose really 100% of that free market. And now you end up with this mess that everybody hates, but it works really, really well for some people. So this is where it is time for the citizenry to strike back. And if we're going to strike back, we really have got to choose our weapons carefully. And this is where it's really interesting to me that the founders had the foresight to be able to see 200 years ago, really being good students of human nature, what kind of tools to put in the toolbox for us to use. Okay? Such a tool is found in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. This is where we deal with amendments. Now, I know you've had people talk to you about Article 5 before, so I don't need to go over a lot of that ground. But I do want to make one little distinction. Just speaking for myself, I tend not to respond well to people saying, it's an emergency, it's a catastrophe, you need to have this amendments convention, the founders put it in there, pull the ripcord, break the glass, it's an emergency, that's what they put it in there for. I don't respond to that, and frankly I don't really believe that. The founders put in the state-initiated means of proposing amendments, not just in case of a catastrophe. They put it in there to be used in parallel with the other method of proposing amendments, which is through Congress. In either case, the states still ratify. You still need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. But I get a little irritated when I hear people sell this idea, and more I'm seeing this, where they're saying this catastrophic language, this break glass, it's an emergency. No, and I'm not saying there's not an emergency. Remember what I said a moment ago about normalcy bias? We always have to be on the guard for something that's coming in that's going to be potentially disastrous. But I don't think that is particularly motivating when you present it in those terms. What I'd rather do is look at it in more sober terms and bring this tool back out, okay, to not just be used one time. I want this tool to be used routinely by the states, because this is, so we all learned that the Constitution is a system of checks and, everybody, balances, right? So that's what the Constitution is intended to do. Perhaps one of the most important balances is found in the Constitution is that found in Article 5, where the states have the ability to propose and then later ratify amendments. The reason that's the ultimate check and balance is because that is what was intended to maintain the power relationship between the states and the federal government. That is the one thing, and the reason we know this is because this was the closing argument that was made in so many of the state ratifying conventions. So we really know what was in their minds when they proposed this thing. So what has happened? This is a use it or lose it proposition. The failure to use the state method of proposing and then later ratifying amendments has necessarily caused the federal government to grow completely unchecked. So when you look at the system today and it's so ridiculously out of proportion, you say, how could this happen? Is this just the nature of things? Did they not anticipate this problem? They absolutely did anticipate it, and they gave us a tool to use the thing, and so we need to use the tool. So there are a lot of different organizations and activists who are pushing one or more idea to use this Article 5, this Convention for Proposing Amendments idea, to advance a particular amendment. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of these organizations. We've got them on the right and the left, and of no particular party. So one of the ideas is to just do a general a convention for proposing amendments, where there's nothing specified, where anything can be discussed, and it has to be voted on. It functions very much like a state legislature, so you have the same kind of a structure, same kind of parliamentary process. The Convention of States organization recently did a simulation, and it was really something to see. And you can actually go online and get the video and watch this, and it looks like you're watching a legislature, but they're actually talking about amendments. And so you can have a convention that's just, anybody propose what it is. That's probably, I think, what the founders envisioned the way this tool would be used. Okay, or you can specify the limits of what is going to be discussed. And so the Convention of States, for instance, says, well, we're going to discuss just a few things. We're going to discuss the fiscal restraints on the federal government. We're going to talk about limiting their terms, and we're going to talk about the scope of government as far as the Commerce Clause and those kinds of things. Okay. Then you have organizations on the left who want to overturn the Citizens United decision. Okay, so they call this campaign finance reform, and they want to have a convention to discuss just that and potentially advance amendments that way. Then you have another one. You have a few more I'm leaving out, but these are the major ones I want to cover. And then you have the one that is of particular interest to me, and that is the one that is very, very focused on the idea of limiting the terms of Congress. Okay, so whatever gets proposed in an amendments convention, remember, it still has to be ratified. I don't think anything coming out of an amendments convention is going to be a panacea, but if you look at the good that it can do, I've been fascinated about term limits since really I first started writing about this back in 2012. And it's because it seemed to me there was the one thing that people on Capitol Hill fear the most. The one thing. Term limits. If you limit their terms, because right now, I'm going to tell you, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, in Maryland, just outside the Beltway. And I went to school with the sons and daughters of members of Congress. And so I got to know them, and I always got a kick out of the fact that sometimes their families were from the South. You know, the mom and dad had a thick Southern accent, and the kids spoke like I did, you know, because they were products of the Washington, D.C. area. They just assimilated in it. They came, when somebody gets elected to Congress, they come to stay. They do not come to serve for a couple of terms and go home. And one of my favorite commentary on this was my father used to say, he was a regulatory attorney downtown, and he used to say his favorite time of year was when newly elected members of Congress came in. And they had that sit down with the House leadership or the Senate, you know, whatever their party's leadership was, and they got the play ball speech, right? You know, it's like you're not gonna do what your constituents want. We have a seniority system here, and you're gonna play ball. The best you can hope for is that you get a little bit of seniority. We'll let you vote last. Okay, so if we don't need your vote, then you can vote the way you want to vote. Up until that time, you're voting this way. And of course, they get there, and they discover they never have to wait in line at a restaurant. They never have to worry about a parking space. You know, they want to go someplace. Somebody's got a corporate jet going that way. They go to they get these junkets where they go play. They'll do 15 minutes worth of meetings and 3 days worth of golf. You know, I mean, this is the culture. They got the Friends and Family program. Dennis Hastert. Do you guys remember Dennis Hastert from a few years ago, the Speaker of the House?
Yep.
So when they kind of deposed Newt in, I guess had to be, 97 or something, or 98, they brought in Dennis Hastert. Dennis Hastert previously had been a high school wrestling coach. He came to Washington with little or no net worth. I have my own personal theory, and this is just my own guess, as to how this guy ended up Speaker of the House. I think they looked for the biggest dope they could find, and they made this guy Speaker of the House. Okay? He turned out not to be as big a dope as they thought, because he ended up being pretty crafty. But there's a lot of things that happened with him. One of the things that happened was his son, who a couple weeks before had been an assistant manager at a video rental store, was now a K Street lobbyist with Google as his client. Okay? Now, the history on Dennis Hastert has been written. We know that he ended up leaving Congress worth tens of millions of dollars, being basically a land baron. They diverted some road, I don't know, it's like 40 miles to go right through his property so he'd get frontage on both sides. There was all these deals. He ended up paying this extortion for somebody he molested when he was a high school wrestling. I mean, it just gets sicker and sicker with these guys. Okay? This is emblematic of the corrupting nature of this institution. And this is something that was not lost on the founders. And so a lot of people say, well, you know, it's kind of interesting because you had term limits in the Articles of Confederation, but they didn't make it into the Constitution. You know, why is that? And I actually think that it could very well have been an oversight. They had a lot of other things they were deciding, and at the time, it really wasn't all that terribly important because really there wasn't the modern day phenomenon of people coming into office and staying there forever. They just didn't have that. In fact, you could get it as late as the 1950s, and the average length of time that somebody would be in Congress would be about 1.5 terms. So it really didn't become the problem that it is today with people staying there for decades, and I'm not exaggerating, okay, until the modern era. Even so, Thomas Jefferson, a lot of the founders thought it was a major, major failing of the Constitution when it was drafted to replace the Articles. And the term they used back then was rotation in office. This was the idea. It's rotation in office, so you always have new blood, new ideas coming in. And they knew, one thing the founders were really good at is they really were students of human nature. And they knew that if somebody, this is one of the reasons they were against a king, right? They knew that if you institutionalize power, and if you lead people in positions of power for too long, you will necessarily get the kind of corruption that really, really becomes a problem given enough time. So this is a major failing that they left out of the Constitution, and it's not the only thing that they've left out of the Constitution. Remember, they didn't have a succession plan for the vice president, for instance, and they had to put that in. So the reason you have an amendment process is to deal with changes over time, changes in technology, oversights in drafting, okay, and completely unforeseen events or problems. And term limits, I think, would be in this category. But I can think of nothing more potent than to end careerism in Washington, because of the fact that when these guys do get to Capitol Hill, they may have had a great history as a state legislator, but they lose those state sensibilities the minute they get to Washington, because they go to Washington to stay. So the idea here is to, and kind of our model idea is 2 terms in the Senate, so that's 12 years, and 3 terms in the House. Okay? And so it's a relatively modest proposal to, and I think it's still too long. I would prefer to see no consecutive terms, would be my preferred means. And that's actually what you had in the Articles of Confederation. In the Articles of Confederation, you could serve, they were 3-year terms. You had to take 3 years off before you were eligible to run again. Benjamin Franklin insisted in the Pennsylvania Constitution that they had to take 2 cycles off. And what I think is kind of attractive about that idea is you preserve the idea of institutional memory, because you might have somebody who served 12 years ago say, hey, I remember when I was here the first time, back in the early 2000s, we had this come up and here's how we dealt with it. So you have some kind of institutional memory. It's not always a bunch of rookies. But when it comes to rookies versus veterans on Capitol Hill, I'm very much with Bill Buckley on this. Does anybody remember the Bill Buckley quote about who he'd like to see in Congress? He said, "I'd rather be governed by the first 535 names in the phone book than by the current crop of guys that we have up there." And the other thing we see is that institutionally, it really doesn't matter whether they're Republicans or Democrats. We get the same thing. We get business as usual, kick the can, raise the debt ceiling. Do you remember when the Tea Parties came into existence? Kind of spontaneously in that, I think it was the 2010 cycle. And the one thing that they picked up that they all started running on was, we are going to refuse to raise the debt ceiling. Right? That was their mantra. We're not, no more debt ceiling, no more debt, no more this, no more that. So we had about 70-some freshman Republicans coming that year. And they caved in. They caved in almost immediately. And by the summer of 2011, I think it was actually July of 2011, they used a very, very clever backroom deal to raise the debt ceiling and do it under the radar screen so that nobody, even people who are trying to pay attention to this, missed it because of the tactics they used. So all of a sudden, all these guys that we had go up there running on how they were going to raise the debt ceiling just caved in, and we couldn't figure out who they were. We had to do some detective work to figure out, and what turned out to be, of the 77, I think, that we sent up there, all but 20 of them caved in. And it was more than enough to carry the day, and that's how we got the debt ceiling raised. This is the kind of thing I just don't know how, with career politicians who have one objective. You get elected to Congress, you have one objective and one objective only. What is that objective?
The obvious.
What is the objective?
Get reelected.
Get reelected. For how long?
As long as you can.
Forever. Because that is your life now. You have just hit the jackpot of jackpots. Okay? Now, this is where we get into something that's a little scary. We get in the area of cognitive dissonance. So I had the opportunity to debrief a few of the people who participated in this exercise the COS did a couple weeks ago. And this was a massive success. This was a really, really interesting exercise. They simulated what it would actually be like to have this convention. And so they had different committees, and one of the committees was of particular interest to me. Can anybody guess what it is? It was term limits, right? And so I knew a couple of people who were on that committee, and I was able to debrief a couple of people who were on that committee. And one of the things that came out, and the reason I want to alert you to this, and I want everybody to know about this, is in Colorado, for instance, our state representatives have term limits. In a lot of states, you have term limits at the state level. They tried to limit their federal officials, members of Congress. That was thrown out in 1995. We know that story. Okay, so we know we need an amendment to make this happen legally. But so many of the state legislators, is this a surprise to anybody in this room that legislators don't like the idea of having their terms limited? Okay? Doesn't come as much of a surprise.
it was a citizen initiative.
It was an initiative, and that's one of the things they would never. That's the thing, and this is why you can never count on Congress to limit their terms. We have to do it for them. So, if you were to take a map of the United States and color in the states that were initiative states, and then overlay the states that have term limits, they'd be the same states. That's the only thing. I think there might be like one exception to this, but pretty much if we didn't have initiative in this state, we would not have term limits even for our state representatives. The reason I make this point is because try as this individual that I know did to make the case that the term limits that were being discussed at that conversation was to limit members of Congress. No matter how much that was pointed out, they heard term limits and they thought of their term limit. And even though you could make the case to them saying, hey, the whole idea here is to open up space in Congress that you might want to run for. This is going to create more opportunities for you, statistically, to get into one of those spots. And it's good for us because hopefully, for the time you're there, you are not going to forget. You're not going to move in permanently. You're not going to forget the state that sent you, right? The people who sent you. You're going to have those state, what I call state sensibilities. You're not going to depart from those things while you're up there, okay? They were so furious that voters, that citizens had limited their terms, that they just had this knee-jerk pushback on the whole idea. Now, luckily, the case was able to be made, and they did come up with a proposal. Yeah, Ralph.
Could you give me the antecedent to the pronoun they? Who is they in that sentence?
So in this exercise, about 85% of the commissioners who participated in this exercise were state legislators, and about 15% were people who were active and knowledgeable politically, but were not at the moment state legislators. And I think they did that on purpose, so there'd be a mix. What was really great about that, the fact that you had state legislators, is they knew exactly how to do their job. So the thing functioned very much like any. If you go to any state legislature, whether it's a House or a Senate, you're going to see procedures and vocabulary being used. So they were really in their element. But it was really interesting how they had this disconnect that even though you would think they would want to open up seats that they could eventually take, they were thinking, I think on some level, and this is the only, I mean, I'll welcome other ideas about this. Maybe this is a great conversation point. The only conclusion I can come to is even though statistically they were less likely to ever be able to hold one of those seats because they're currently locked up by people who are not term limited, they are thinking, look, I don't want that party to end before I get there because even though the odds are not good, I still believe that I could be a future member of Congress, and when I get there, that's the big payoff. I don't want to have my term limited. Now, that's the only thing I can come up with. Anybody have anything to add to that?
I was just going to suggest that.
Yeah. I mean, that's got to be what it is. You know, that they're just thinking, look, this is my shot. You're taking away, this is like telling them there's no Santa Claus. You know, you're going to get there, we're going to change the institution. And by the way, let's make no mistake about this. I don't want to be too grandiose in my remarks. If we limited Congress, really in any way, even the proposal that they talked about, which is 12-12, okay, basically 12 years in the House, 12 years in the Senate, you know, we favor 3 terms in the House, that's 6 years in the House, 2 terms in the Senate, 12 years in the Senate. I still think that's rather modest, okay, I don't think that's a lot to ask. We got that. That changes the institution. That changes the whole thing around. Now they're just up there for a time and they got to go back home. Yeah.
How do you avoid the John Dingell situation?
Where he's up there for 40 years?
Where he's there for 40 years and then his wife takes over.
Yeah. So
or his son.
Right. So, you know, we see this, this is one, whenever I hear somebody say, you know, my seat, you ever hear that?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah,
go,
he took my parking space out there.
and I go through the roof when I hear this. You know, my seat. It's not your seat, it's our seat. If we had term limits, they'd be taken out in however many years it was. And yes, theoretically, so I call this, that's pretty funny because I call this the Putin-Medvedev school of politics, where they just keep flipping back and forth. But these are lifetime terms, so they would not be able to, each one of them would have an individual set of terms. So you couldn't do anything about that.
I want to just jump in here for a second. If you're going to speak, please take the microphone because your voice is not going to reach there.
Okay, that's cool. So, yeah, I mean, this is, I'm really careful about presenting anything as a silver bullet, but if I could pick some, if people used to ask me all the time, because I wrote 2 books about this topic, about this whole Article 5 process. The first book was really just about the process, and the second one talked about specific amendment ideas, okay? And so I had a whole bunch of them, but the common question that I got everywhere was, if you could just pick one amendment, what would be that amendment? And absolutely, I wouldn't miss a beat. I would go right to term limits, because term limits, more than anything else, changes that institution to be much more of the people. Let me tell you another reason. So, it's really an opportunity to look at the low-hanging fruit. Okay, one of the problem with some, and I'm going to be very careful here because I don't want to pick on anybody unnecessarily, but with some of the organizations advancing certain amendment reform ideas, they have unnecessarily made themselves partisan. You know, we're used to that in this day and age. Everything is right-left, we think. But you know, some things are not. And when we get into procedural type reforms, let me give you a couple examples. Term limits is obviously one of them. Single issue bills. Okay, in Colorado, if you have a bill, it's got to be about one subject, right? Is that a Republican or a Democrat idea? I don't think it's either, right? Okay, I think you can go through a lot of these things. A balanced budget amendment. Okay, is that necessarily a Republican idea? Aren't there Democrats out there who say, we don't want to spend ourselves into oblivion? Most states have some kind of a balanced budget amendment. Okay, pretty much all the initiative states now have some kind of term limits. Is that necessarily partisan? Here's a statistic for you. Republicans, 3 out of 4 Republicans support the idea of term limits. 2 out of 3 Democrats support the idea of term limits. Okay, I don't yet know what that percentage is in terms of our elected officials under the Gold Dome in Colorado, but I'm going to find out. That's part of what I'm going to do, is get a whip count. We're going to find, and I have a sneaking suspicion that it's not as popular with those folks as it might be with us. And that's where all of you come in. I said earlier I'm going to give you a couple things to learn, a couple things to do, etc. Well, here's one of the things I want you to do. And let me introduce it this way. So, I'm kind of a little bit of a history buff, and one of the most fascinating moments in history that I think has relevance to what we're living through was a moment in 1914, the first year of the Great War, which later became known as World War I. And this is on the Western Front. So you had the Germans on one side, you had the French and the English on the other side. Remember, we were not in that war until much, much later. And at this point in the war, everybody there was a volunteer. So these were very motivated people. They were going to go, and they were going to fight this war. Nobody could figure out what the war was for. To this day, there are still arguments over what started this crazy war. Okay? But here they were, and they were in these trenches, these miserable trenches. They got to the front, and they realized that this thing was way different than what they bargained for. And then they were all supposed to be home by Christmas. That was every war. That's the mantra, right? We're going to be done by Christmas. And so Christmas rolled around, 1914, and they were still in their freezing ditch with like ice and mud and trench foot and all this stuff. And Christmas came, and on the English on the western side of the trench, they heard the Germans singing Christmas carols, and they heard them singing in German, and they would sing a Christmas carol, and then the English and the French would sing the same Christmas carol in their language. And they kind of went back, and this happened spontaneously all up and down the front. At some point, somebody threw a soccer, what we call a soccer ball, over from one ditch, and it kind of went back and forth a little bit. And it was kind of like an unofficial truce. Nobody was shooting as Christmas. Eventually, somebody, and this happened in different places, one side or the other, would take their hat off, and they would come over the top, and they would take the chance that they were going to be shot. And they would show they were empty-handed. And what happened is, once they saw that it was not a threat, they all came out of the trenches. And they all started shaking hands and started showing pictures of their family and playing, kicking the soccer ball around. And this went on over hundreds of miles of front, spontaneously. The officers were losing their mind over this. The institutional, the regular Army guys on both sides were furious. There were court-martials. There were probably, who knows, there were probably executions as a result of this. This is the worst kind of fraternizing with the enemy. Okay? Eventually, Christmas was over, and they went back into their ditches and went back to killing each other again. Why do I tell this story? For one day, for one lousy day, they were able to stop their war. And they were able to just have a day where they could have some peace. Okay? I am making a pitch along these lines. I'm talking, everybody here is a libertarian, so we're in a different category here. I'm talking to Republicans, and I'm talking to Democrats, and I'm telling that story. And I'm saying, this is something we can agree on. This is something that has no right or left to it. Is there an opportunity for you, just on this one issue, to come out of the trench, and we can go back to killing each other later. You can go back to throwing bombs at each other later. You can go back to screaming at each other later. That's fine. But I want one day, when this thing comes up in a committee meeting, as it did here this last year, this thing came up in a Senate committee hearing, I testified. Okay? We had no grassroots organization in the state to back us up. And I've seen, remember I said I'm in 9 different states, I've seen what it's like to have the support of the grassroots in that committee room. Okay? We didn't have it. As a result of us not having that support in the committee room, what do you think happened? We got shot down. Okay? We're going to do it again next year. When we do this again next year, I'm going to put out a clarion call for absolutely everybody who cares about this issue. And it's especially important that this happened in Colorado. I'll tell you why in a minute. But I'm going to ask people to come out on that one day, and I'm going to ask people to do the unthinkable. I'm going to ask Democrats to sit down next to Republicans, and Republicans to sit down next to Democrats and Libertarians, if they can find a seat, to be in there too. I want absolutely everybody to be in there in that one lousy day where we can send a message to a committee of about 7 people in either the House or the Senate, and we can stand and we can say, we are here for one reason. We want to see this. We want you to pass a resolution that is what we call an application for an Article 5 convention to discuss term limits. That's all it's doing, is discussing it. The reason Colorado, states like Colorado, are so important is we have 50 states in this country. We have 31 that are currently under Republican control, and we have 11 that are under Democrat control. And the remaining 8 are split states like Colorado. If we can get this thing done in a state like Colorado that has a split legislature, that is by definition I don't want to say bipartisan, it is a nonpartisan movement. I think that will send a message that the rest of the country needs to hear. And that will obviate the mistake that some of the other amendment groups have made by becoming unnecessarily partisan. We want to avoid partisanship like the plague, because this is not a partisan issue. Do you realize that elected officials are using our own partisanship against us? They are very happy if we're at war because they get to live their life and we are stuck living under their laws. But we're going to turn those over on them. And I think we can actually do it. And if, by the way, if I didn't think we could pull this thing off, I would not be dedicating this amount of my life to it. But I think we can actually make history, because this has never been done before in history. So this is a good place to pause. Are there any questions about the procedure or the concerns or anything like that? You want to grab a mic? We got a mic we can pass down?
Bless you. And please speak up loudly, because the mic has a...
Yeah, you probably know, do you know Hans Hermann Hoppe? Do you know
Yes,
him?
yes. Hoppe, yeah. He's an economist, he's a recluse, quite a recluse.
In a lot of ways, he says that a monarchy is more desirable than a democracy, because a monarchy is like owning the government as opposed to renting it, and you take better care of what you own, especially if you want, your children and your grandchildren are going to inherit it. So if you shorten the amount of time that these representatives can rent the government, aren't you just accelerating they're looting and plundering because they have a less amount of time in which to do it.
It's an interesting argument, and I'm familiar with this argument. The other part of this argument that you hear from people who advance a monarchy is that the current monarchs want to leave a country intact for their children to rule over when their generation comes. So I definitely understand, and it's an interesting argument, but it is something that has worked very, very well for us. When we had rotation in government, all we can do is kind of look at how things ended up. And when we had people not getting so deeply invested in becoming the ruling class, that worked better for Americans. So it's really kind of hard to say a principle, because remember, these guys are coming for a short period of time, and if they're going to have the ability to stay, they're always going to look to their own interests. But if, on the other hand, they're only going to be there for a short period of time, these people have children, these people have families, they have states that they care about. I have not lost faith in the American character to do the right thing, and I think what is in direct competition with that is individual careerism. Is I think more of an impediment on that. So all I know is what's worked for us in the past when we didn't have the situation, and I'd like to get back to where we were before.
I want to repeat the question I asked earlier.
Okay.
Because I don't think you answered it.
Okay.
And that is, if you give a congressman or a senator 6 years or 12 years
Right.
in Washington, you can bet that they're going to stay there, and they're going to become lobbyists or lawyers
Mm-hmm.
who act as lobbyists. And the people who are going to run Washington are still going to be
Oh yeah.
the staff that'll hang around and maybe run for the seat
Mm-hmm.
when the congressman can no longer run. And is it really a solution to limit their terms when you know? I would love to take a survey to find out how many congressmen and senators actually returned to their home district at the end of their time in Washington.
Yeah, I think we know that number, and it's a very large number stay there and become lobbyists. And the reason I know that is, as I said earlier, I went to school with them, so I know them. And so the argument that you're making is sometimes called the permanent bureaucracy argument. And one of the things I like to point out is that there are no perfect solutions, okay? But to me, what makes a lot more sense is that there's only one guy who is going to face the voters on Election Day, and that's that elected representative. And I know a lot of us have this image that, you know, the elected guy, you know, the old man in the office, is this cipher kind of an individual who just gets pushed around by his staff and they tell him how to vote and things like that. That's really not the case. I mean, these guys really do take voting seriously, and they will vote their conscience or their interest. And I think that's the dividing line. If their time in Washington is limited, I think it's much more likely that they will vote their conscience than their interest to perpetuate their job. So I definitely understand, and I'm sympathetic to the permanent bureaucracy argument. But what I know for sure is that these guys right now are so insulated and so invulnerable. They get reelected. It's a perfunctory election every single time. That cannot be good. I think the country works so much better when the average length of time was 1.5 terms. And that's what I said before. I really want to go back to that. And the fact that they hate this so much tells me we're onto something.
Let me jump in before you, Larry. I want to give you a heads up that Larry Sarner, who has the microphone at the moment,
Okay.
I believe disagrees with, and I just had an Aleppo moment, Bob Berry's argument. Am I correct on that? And please speak into the microphone.
Yeah, I do have a
Closer
couple of
to your mouth.
disagreements, yeah.
Okay.
But I'm actually after more information
Sure.
about the process. I apologize for coming in late. I can't seem to control Boulder traffic, whatever.
Right.
And I think I got a ticket, or red light flash on me. So,
Ouch. Ouch.
On 28. But in any event, what I'm particularly interested in is because this is the first really serious effort to amend the Constitution through convention. There are a lot of actions or reactions to it, and some of them are ancient objections about the runaway convention notion, also about when do you actually have a call, a true call for the election? When do you have your 34 states? And like one concern that came along with around the 13th and 14th Amendments, and that is, can you rescind your request?
I can answer those questions seriatim.
And so that's what I'd like to change the subject from
Sure.
term limits
To more Article 5.
More Article 5.
That's-
and you know those issues
Yeah.
and such. I'd like your reaction.
Yeah, let me take them one at a time. So let's talk about.
If you hadn't already.
Yeah, no, this is good, and really it's the technical aspects of Article 5 that is actually my bailiwick, I think. So let's talk about the possibility for rescissions. The best research that we have in this era is from Robert Nadelson of the Independence Institute, who I believe has spoken here before, and it is generally agreed that a state can absolutely rescind their application. So if they made an application at some point and then later thought better of it, they can absolutely rescind that. Unless and until they rescind an application will last forever. Okay? And part of my evidence for that, and a real hero to me, is a guy by the name of Gregory Watson. Does anybody know this name, Gregory Watson? Well, you may not know his name, but you know what he did. So back right after the Constitution was ratified, we needed this Bill of Rights. It didn't include a Bill of Rights. And the states were going to use Article 5 to advance their own Bill of Rights. And they gave it to Congress as an ultimatum. They said, look, either you propose this or we're going to propose this. Okay? And Congress said, just relax, we'll do it. What a lot of people don't remember is that there weren't 10 amendments in that package. There were 12, exactly. All right? They ratified 10 of them. One of them kind of lagged behind and was just, you need 3/4 of the states to get that thing ratified. And it kept getting states passing it. It just goes to the legislature for a vote of the legislature, up or down. It doesn't need to go to the governor, just the legislature. But they kept on adding states. And so this thing was just missing it all the way along the line. And by the 20th century, this last amendment really had been all but forgotten about. Until a guy by the name of Gregory Watson in the 1980s started a letter writing campaign, and he discovered this issue. And this issue was very simple. The idea was, this is the amendment that was never ratified, was Congress cannot raise their own pay before an election. They have to do it after the election. They have to stand to the voters if they're going to raise their pay. Pretty simple. That's pretty, that's not too big a deal. So he started this letter writing. This is pre-internet. This is 92, 90. Actually, it was early. It's like late 80s. It actually got ratified in 1994. That was the 27th Amendment. That was the very last amendment. It took 204 years to get that thing ratified. So that is the evidence that we know that these things never expire on their own. It's kind of a long answer, but that was actually a point I wanted to make about how the amendment process works. What was your question about the 13th and the 14th Amendment, though? I forgot that.
It actually was very similar to
Okay.
What you said. It's a number of, they started putting in limitations.
Yeah.
They started putting in limitations on the length of time that an outstanding amendment could be considered.
Not in the 13th. I don't think so.
No. Eventually, it didn't happen with them. But
I know what you're talking
there were
about. Okay.
Concerns.
Now I know.
Could you rescind your ratification? at any point. That's what happened.
Not your ratification. Yeah, you can rescind so the process is to trigger an amendments convention. You need 2/3 of the states. So our current number would put that at 34. So 34 states this next legislative session decided to jump on, for instance, the term limit bandwagon and have a convention that was just going to discuss term limits.
I heard balanced budget amendment was the
They got about 28. They got about 28. But let's just say somebody tipped and they went to 34. Okay, that would trigger the process. All that is doing, and this also goes to your runaway question. All an amendment convention does is discuss amendment proposals along the lines of what the call was. So if the call was to discuss a balanced budget amendment, that's kind of what that's about. If it was to discuss term limits, that's what it's about. Okay, I happen to be somebody who's not afraid of a general amendments convention that is not the same as a constitutional convention, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But if we tipped at 34, they would have the discussion. They would either advance an amendment proposal, one or more amendment proposals that were according to that call. So, for instance, if we had a term limits convention, it would be number of terms in the House might be one amendment. Number of terms in the Senate might be a separate amendment. They could be one. Okay, a separate amendment, or maybe the same, could be how many consecutive terms they can have. The convention can advance any proposal, and that's the key word. These are proposals they want. Once that proposal's out, unless part of the proposal limits the time for ratification, which is, I think, maybe what you're asking about the 13th and 14th Amendment, although that wasn't until later, they can say, yes, we are advancing this proposal, but it has a 5-year or a 7-year ratification deadline. And after that deadline, if it's not ratified by that time, just like the ERA, it disappears. Just like several other amendments that have been ratified, starting with, I believe, put me on the spot here, but I'd say starting with about, I think, the 17th Amendment, possibly, they started putting in time limits. And I actually think that's a good idea. And that has been adjudicated at the Supreme Court level, and that has been found constitutional. That, as long as it's part of the application process. Okay? So that is how it works. And once it's ratified, it's ratified. So a state can't go back and unratify a ratification.
Has actually gone over the
That's correct.
Requirement.
That's
but
right.
The question is, can you rescind it before then?
Before the actual event, before the convention?
Before it actually becomes part of the Constitution. Then you have to amend the Constitution.
Once the convention is called, at that point the convention is called. And by the way, interestingly, Congress does not need to have 2/3 of the states to call a convention of the states for an amendments convention. And in actuality, there have been over 400 applications over the years, but never 2/3 on any one subject. Which is one of the reasons. That's I was going to say. That's one of the reasons. So with term limits, we're kind of late to the party when it comes to the state initiated process. But the good news about that is we can learn from history. We can learn from some of the mistakes that other organizations have made, and we can be very, very careful that the states use similar language. That is really, really important, because otherwise you know exactly what can happen. Congress can play games. And this is a particular problem with the balanced budget amendment. Some of their applications may need to be redone. Florida, they had to redo the one in Florida. For that reason, it didn't match. So it couldn't be the term is aggregated with the other ones.
Larry, could I please ask you to put the mic really close to your mouth, because I'm not getting any. It's a bad mic.
Get a good one.
I'll explain later.
Sorry. So
Closer.
One last, and I'm sure there are other people who want to jump in with their own, is have there been struggles over the actual wordings of calls and any adjudication over any of that? And where do we stand right now?
Yeah. So, as far as adjudication on the language in an application, it's actually not a call. A call is when Congress calls a convention, so that becomes the call, and that is what limits the discussion of the convention. Prior to that time, the proper term is application, and so those haven't been adjudicated. They will be almost certainly when the magic number is triggered. Somebody will probably sue, and that is your exposure to that kind of thing is severely limited if you have language substantially the same from state to state to state. So term limits has very little exposure to that. Balanced budget amendment has a significant exposure to that kind of a problem. Okay, so that will almost certainly be adjudicated. What was the other part of that question? Remind me. Okay, sorry. Okay.
I want to make sure
Yeah.
I understand what you said. I heard you saying that the states can call a convention outside of Article 5.
Oh, yeah, let me talk about that. That's a really interesting point.
How many states?
So, the states as sovereigns can call a constitutional convention if they wanted to. So if the states, for whatever reason, decide to get together and say, hey, we want to have a constitutional convention, they can do this. They do not need... Article 5 is strictly about the amendment process. The only reason to invoke Article 5 is to set the discussion to just the proposing of amendments. The reason I point that out is to make a distinction between an amendments convention and a constitutional convention. What's being discussed now in 2016 is an Article 5 amendments convention, period. What is happening is a lot of the people who are opponents of this idea are making a straw man argument saying that what we're advocating is a constitutional convention. That is not correct. A constitutional convention is a completely different animal, and absolutely nobody is talking about it.
Okay. What happens if New York and California don't show up for a constitutional convention?
I can't speak about a constitutional convention, but I can speak about what an Article 5 convention would be. Because we're talking about Article 5. We're not talking about so I'm not going to answer any questions about constitutional conventions because it's a moot point. Nobody's talking about a constitutional convention. If you want to ask me that question as it relates to an Article 5 convention, I can answer.
Yeah.
Because that's where my that's where my what little expertise I have in this world, that's where it is. So if a state, it would not be unusual for a state to not attend a convention. Okay, we have this in our history. The Annapolis Convention was the last convention the states held before the famous Philadelphia, what we later called Constitutional Convention. And of the 13 states, only 5 showed up. And as a result, when we were under the Articles, we needed all 13 states to agree to amend anything in the Articles, which is kind of a lesson. I'm going to come back to that in a moment because I think it's important. But a state does not have to show up. They do not have to attend. They would have no voice, and it would just be whatever percent of the people. The states vote individually, by the way. No matter how many commissioners they send, it's still one state, one vote. So they would just, same thing as just not voting. And it is their prerogative. But, interestingly, if 34 states triggered an amendments convention, let's say on term limits, some of the states that didn't vote either way on that, they would all be able to participate in this convention. And, by the way, a very important part of the discussion of a convention like this would be the people who oppose term limits. That's an important argument that needs to be made. All a convention does is create a place for a conversation to be held and a proposal to either be made or to not be made. So so people who oppose the idea absolutely have a place at that table and should voice their concerns about whatever it is. And we saw this play out in real time at this recent simulation, and I thought it was fascinating. And you can watch it too. You can go on just do a search for Convention of States, and you'll be able to find it.
Did you see the Barron's article about?
Some months ago or recently?
No, last week.
No, I did not see that.
It's the last page of Barron's weekly
Okay.
paper.
It was about the simulation?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. I'll look it up.
Anybody else?
I'm going to talk, and I'm close enough to the mic. So I have several comments to make, if you wouldn't mind. Before I make my comments about this, I have some administration stuff that I need
Sure.
to do that's almost relevant to this. Yeah, and that's what I'm. In point of fact, Bill, could you take the microphone and make your announcement?
All right, I'm going to be talking with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center together at after dinner on Monday night in a small gathering, 5 or 6 people. And if anybody here is interested in doing that, the topic's going to be U.S.-NATO conflict with Russia, and I guess it's going to be and dangers of nuclear war, because I just got this notice from the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center that they're having a speaker at Dwayne Physics about the prospect of nuclear war and how close we are. I personally think we're just about at the same stage as we were during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's amazing to me that none of the media is covering what's going on with the threats to and the attacks between United States aircraft and Russian aircraft in Syria. So that's 2 opportunities. You got Tuesday night at Dwayne Physics, and if somebody will contact me, got room for 1 or 2 more people to come talk to these people on Monday night.
Very good. That's one piece of administrative. Blah. And so now we're turning back to Mr. Berry.
Okay, I got a couple things I want to. This is a good time to put these things in. I met this morning with some people from Open Boulder who are advocating in favor of a yes vote for question 302 in Boulder. This is to term limit the Boulder City Council. And one of the things I was really impressed with these folks is they are trying very hard not to let partisanship intrude into their issue. And I think this is a healthy thing. And we support term limits wherever it is as a general principle. And I think they're going to help us at the state level as well. So I promised that I would mention them. And I wanted to pass around, or did I already pass this around? Okay, so if you have this, I recommend you get in touch with these guys and do what you can to help advance that, assuming you're supporting it. The other thing I want to ask is a favor for those of you who support this idea of term limits. It is very, very important that we get as many people on our petition as possible. And so I've created a resource that makes it really, really easy. You know, there are these new what they call top-level domains on the internet. So everybody's used to something .com or .net or .org. Well, they got a whole bunch of new ones now, and one of them, I just discovered this, was .limited. I guess because in some countries they don't say corporation, they say limited, like limited, corporation. So I grabbed term.limited. And if you go to term.limited, it's going to put you right to a Google form, which is our petition. And I would very, very much appreciate it. For those of you who support this idea of term limits, go to term.limited and just hit enter, and no .com, just term.limited, and it'll go right to the form. And I would certainly appreciate your signing that electronically, but also, very importantly, I would appreciate if you would give your address, because if you give your address, then that helps us pinpoint your district. And when I go to discuss this with members of the legislature, it's really helpful to me if I can say, here are all the people in your district, because that's all they care about. Here are the voters in your district who are supporting this idea. And they'll look at those addresses, and these guys a lot of times have walked their district, so they know the addresses, and that means a lot. So if you wouldn't mind, I would really appreciate it if you go there.
2 things. Number one, actually lots more than 2
Sure,
things.
okay.
Number one, is that LIMITED
Yeah.
or LTD?
No, it's the word.
Okay.
So spell it. It's not the abbreviation. It's term. That's good thinking. Yeah, term.limited, the word. Spell it out.
Okay. Could I ask you to please send me email so to remind me it goes into my next newsletter?
Absolutely. I will do that.
Great. In the discussions about term limits, one of the things that people are concerned about, or some people are concerned about, is the lack of institutional memory as people leave.
Right.
Is anybody talking about, in terms of term limits, having a rising scale, saying, to get into office, first it's at 50% plus one person, and then after that, just keep raising the amount so that people who are in office are incentivized to be responsive to the people they represent.
That's an interesting idea. So I got the best answer you've ever heard for this. And the answer is, that is exactly the kind of thinking that I think is the magic of a convention. Because it's only in that kind of a forum that you can explore some of these ideas and say, what do we want to do? What is the problem that we're trying to fix here? And what are some of the ideas of solutions? And so that would be a solution that could be talked about. My personal favorite is the idea of not having consecutive terms. Just having them run, go back home, whatever else, but then having a maximum number of terms they can ever serve. But that makes it, when you're not running for re-election, it makes it a lot harder when you're coming in, even if you've run in the past. When you have to start from scratch again, it makes it a lot harder. And, that's, I think, what we need is more turnover.
Anybody else have... Heidi, please, the microphone, and please up to your mouth.
Patrick Byrne or something?
Oh, Patrick Byrne. It's a little off topic, but I did want to mention something that I think... I didn't get into this. So last time I was here, I talked to you guys about cryptocurrencies, and this whole world is coming out. And, of course, at the time... I think I first wrote about that 3 years ago. When I was here, I talked about it was over 2 years ago. At the time, it was a very intriguing technology. It hadn't really proved itself as a currency or as a money yet. It was just an interesting... It'd be kind of like talking about the internet in 1990... I don't know, what do you think? 1994, right? When you had the bones, but you really didn't know how revolutionary it was going to be. So now, in the intervening 2 years, we've got a much better idea. And I think this thing is setting up to be a parallel financial system, and I think it's really interesting. So that's one of the things I was going to mention in passing to keep an eye on, because it's something that I think represents a tremendous amount of opportunity going forth. I think it has implications for liberty because it reinstitutes privacy and things like that, the ability to voluntarily exchange. Very importantly, I always like to make an analogy of payphones. When's the last time anybody in here used a payphone? When's the last time you even saw a payphone? You ever see? So in movies, that's the answer I get all the time. So my daughter and I have a running gag. Wherever we are traveling, if we see a payphone, we take a picture of it and we text it to the other. And I was in a Burger King not too long ago, and there was a payphone in this Burger King, and I took a picture. I said it was the funniest thing. So why do I make this point? Why don't we need these anymore?
Revolution in
right.
communication.
Because we have these things, right? Okay, so payphones went the way of the dodo bird because we've got technology that replaced it. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Nobody hated the payphone. We just didn't need it anymore. But people hate banks. And they hate the financial system that we're dealing with right now, because even people who are not particularly interested in economics and talking about the Fed and things like that, they have a sense that when they're printing money, or printing currency is more accurate, they're robbing us, right? If they're printing currency, the value of the currency that you hold is diluted. And people have a sixth sense about that, and they don't like that. And so I think this is a technology that makes banks largely irrelevant. And it sounds fantastical, I realize that, but it did. When I was all geeked out about the internet in 1994, when I had one of the first browsers that was crashing every 5 minutes, nevertheless, we knew that when that technology was perfected, the implications were going to be amazing. Yeah.
The term I use, and I think it's appropriate, is counterfeiting instead of printing.
It's counterfeit.
Yeah,
It really is.
I mean, printing doesn't really convey the point so much as counterfeiting does.
Yeah, and most of that counterfeiting is done electronically, and it's done by banks. So it's kind of an interesting point. We hear about all the billions of currency units that the Fed is creating. That is minor league stuff. The real currency creation is at the individual banks. The banking system creates, when they issue new loans, that's how they get it into the bloodstream of the economy. Something like 94 to 96% of the currency that's actually in circulation is created at the bank. When you make a deposit of $100, that because of the fractional reserve banking, that turns into $1,000. And what's really interesting, there's a big debate going on in economic circles. Some of you have heard this. At some point, this can't continue, right? The old jokes. It's something that's unsustainable can't be sustained, right? That was Herb Stein, I think, who said that. And so we're looking at this. We're saying, now look, I'm not a catastrophist, so I'm not one of these guys who's going around saying you better sell everything and put it in the gold because we're going to have a catastrophe. Look, anything can happen. That could happen. What I think is more likely is I think we may transition to something that's more of a market currency. And I see these cryptocurrencies, specifically Bitcoin, being a very interesting option. And the reason I think it's very, very interesting is for the same reasons I thought the internet was kind of neat, because nobody really owns it, nobody controls it. I remember I used to tell people about it, and people would say, "What's the name of this company? It's called the internet?" And I'm like, no, it's not a company. It's not, they've been asking me like who the CEO was. And I was like, no, there is no CEO. It's the internet. I don't know how to explain it. It's just the internet. Well, this is the same way. This is something where it's just a loose confederation of computers all over the world talking on the same protocol and creating a system that is by itself incredibly strong. It turns out that the more decentralized something is, the harder to kill it is. And nobody can really control it. It's all in the protocol. And that's, to me, what is so fascinating about this idea. So keep an eye on this. Did you have something you want to say about it?
Well,
Mike, get the mic.
Microphone, please.
actually, it's
Closer to your mouth.
less of a comment and more of a question of information, or
Yeah.
a couple questions that emerged.
Okay.
Where do we stand in Backbone if someone actually, who's not too familiar with Bitcoin,
Yeah.
can actually enter into the Bitcoin universe and be able to get out of it when necessary?
Yeah. Okay, so-
And what about the governmental assaults on it?
Yeah.
I read recently in Reason that there was a ironic argument where they had the IRS or someone had ruled that the Bitcoin was property and not currency. I'm not quite sure what the distinction really should be.
Yeah.
And then turned around, and when they tried to accuse somebody of money laundering with Bitcoin,
I said it wasn't money.
they failed because
Yeah.
they define it as
It's-
property.
Yeah.
Really, it comes down to just how secure a medium of exchange it is, and how convenient a medium of exchange it is right now.
So really, really good questions. So let me answer the first one very quickly. It's very easy to get into to purchase Bitcoin, and I recommend. I don't give financial advice, but I do give educational advice. And for the same reason I would have said to somebody in 1994, you need to immediately go out, you need to drop everything, and I mean this, especially if you have young people in your lives. Okay? You do not want them to be illiterate when it came to the internet in 1994, and you do not want them to be illiterate when it comes to cryptocurrencies today. So go out, get yourself, I don't care, $50 or $100 worth of Bitcoin. It's very easy. You go, and I'll send a link around to a company called Coinbase. You can go to Coinbase.com, and I'll send you a link. And if you use my link, you'll get $5 of free Bitcoin, worth of free Bitcoin, which would be like 0.000 Bitcoin. Okay, but that's not the good part. The good part is I get $5 too. so I'll send you a link, and I'd like to do that. I'd love to be the person who introduced you to just for an educational standpoint. I'm not saying buy this as an investment. I'm just saying invest in your education. The way you invest in education is you buy books, you buy materials. You cannot understand this until you get some of it and play with it and see what you can do with it. So it's very easy to get into because you hook it up to your bank account, just like PayPal. And with one click on this phone, and I do this routinely, I can convert however much money I want in my bank account to Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin is in my wallet right on my phone and on my portable devices. And once I have it on that device, I can send it to anyone, anywhere in the world, and I have. And I've sent very significant amounts of money, tens of thousands of dollars I've sent with this phone. Okay, actually, the phone before this.
Did you file your forms?
Whoa.
Yeah. you're on your own, just like any other financial dealings. You're on your own with reporting if you make money in it, but you don't have to report transactions. If you're just converting money out of your bank account, they have a record of. They see what's going on in your bank account. If you're making a profit, you have to report on your profit if you want to pay your taxes appropriately. If you don't, I don't know how they're going to catch you unless it does come out of your bank account. So if I had a business and I was selling something, my favorite example is, say I had some product. My favorite one I love to use is Bob's the Illegal Sunscreen Company. Did you know that it's illegal to have certain kinds of sunscreen in this country that you have everywhere else in the world, but here the FDA regulates sunscreen as a drug, so you can bring it back from Europe, but you can't sell it. So let's say I wanted to sell it, and they would shut me down, right? If I had Visa, MasterCard. When I had my interest in the firearms raw material business that we were in, tried to take Visa, MasterCard. We finally got approved, but because of Operation Choke Point, they made us miserable. Okay? But for people who had Bitcoin, or could get into Bitcoin, they could pay me in 2 seconds and I'd have it. Okay? So the other question was about the regulation, and there's 2 points I want to make about this. I'll get right to you, honey.
More on oppression rather than regulation.
Well, and so here's what's really interesting to me about this. Is the federal government would have you believe that they are two things. They would have you believe that they're omniscient, that they know everything you do, and there are a lot of people who believe this. Tend to be people who are given to conspiracies and things like that. I'm not one of those people. Okay? They know a hell of a lot. They do too much. And I wish they didn't know so much. But they're not omniscient. Okay? And they're not omnipresent. They're not everywhere. Okay? They want you to think that they are. What do you call an entity that's omniscient and omnipresent? That's God. What does that tell you about where they're coming from? Okay? Well, guess what? They're not God. They can make you miserable if they wanted to make a project out of you, but they can't do it to everybody. We do not have Orwell's thought police here, and this so they can write whatever kind of laws they want, but if they don't know about it, if they made it illegal to own Q-tips tomorrow, would people go immediately out and dump all their Q-tips? You know, they'd say nuts to you, right? They wouldn't care. The point is that this is not a U.S. phenomenon. This is a worldwide phenomenon, and there are 6 billion people in the world who currently have no access to banking. These are the same people who didn't have landlines, who skipped an entire generation of telephone technology, went from having no phones to having cell phones. I believe the pattern is there for them to go from having no banking system, no access to international commerce, to having a financial system where you don't need banks. And this is a financial system that is so superior to current banking, in the same way that cell phones are superior to landlines because they're not tied to the wall. Okay? And it's completely anonymous. I always like to make a point. This is really, really important. I always have to look at this because I forget them. There are 5 aspects of money. If you're going to have a money, and I want you to think about our paper currency, and I want you to think about maybe gold. Okay, traditionally has been a money. Okay, they have to have these characteristics. They have to be fungible, right? So an ounce of gold here is the same as an ounce of gold in China. Okay, a dollar bill here is a dollar bill anywhere in the world. If it's a real dollar bill, then it's a dollar bill. It's fungible. It has to be portable. It has to be durable. Gold is very durable. Dollar bills not so much, but they're durable enough. You can put them in your wallet and go around with them, and they don't disintegrate. They have to be a unit of account, so you have to be able to make change, right? So, you know, and it's like, for instance, if you did it with a diamond, if you cut a diamond in half, you don't have 2 halves of equal value to what you started with. You have much less value, right? Okay. Lastly, and very importantly, in the area where the dollar fails, and that is it has to be a store of value. And because they print currency, because they counterfeit currency, whatever term you want to use, and they are diluting the currency that we all have in our account or in our wallet, that ceases to be a store of value. Gold, on the other hand, has proven to be a very good store of value. It's all those other things, and it's a store of value. That's why I think gold is kind of the ultimate money. However, there are 2 other interesting requirements, and I think they are requirements, that haven't been necessary before, but in the 21st century, I believe, make it necessary. Money has to have 2 additional qualities. And those 2 additional qualities is that it has to be transmittable. You have to be able to send it electronically wherever you need to send it. That is a 21st century requirement for money. Okay? And lastly, and this goes to your point as far as the oppression aspect, it has to be concealable. If I had $10,000 worth of gold, you could raid my house and find my $10,000 worth of gold. If I get on an airplane, you see that sign when you go out of the country, if you are carrying more than $10,000, you have to declare your $10,000. Of course, you never know what they're going to do when you declare it. Okay, with Bitcoin, I can have $1 million on my phone, and nobody would know it. I wouldn't have to disclose it. They couldn't get it. If somebody put a gun to my head, I could type in a different PIN number to my wallet to access my wallet, and it'll show $100. Okay, if I type in the right PIN number, maybe it'll have $1 million. It wouldn't be my wallet if it did, but somebody's got $1 million, and so that's the point. So concealability is a 21st century requirement. If you have those two, you can be anywhere in the world, and you could be safe, and you could be functioning in the economy, and nobody would know.
Bob, we have at least 2 speakers, and that's Jim. You've got the microphone. Do you want to speak?
Yes.
And then we have Heidi. Do you mind, Heidi, mind if Jim goes first? Go ahead. Please put the microphone next to your mouth.
Right. I'm looking at this brochure,
Yeah.
and I'm recalling that Ralph was involved in a lawsuit a couple of years ago over the question of the practice that exists among incumbent office holders, and this was specifically the county commission, wasn't it, Ralph?
Yes, it was a county commissioner who went from 2 terms in office to 4 by manipulating various rules about half terms and being appointed. And
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it was.
So what they do is resign, the incumbent resigns in midterm, and that way his or her successor gets an extra term. So this says that 302 would extend from 8 years, 2 terms, to 3 terms or 12 years. But if they continue that practice, it would actually extend a possible term to 16 years or something.
Or
It depends on how they write
or
it.
20, depending on how they manipulate the entry and exits.
It's an interesting point. I would definitely refer you to the people who are running that one, because they'll know the nuances of the way theirs is written. But it does. But I'm going to use the occasion of your comment to say that it is really important how these things are drafted.
Heidi, you're next, and
Yeah.
next to your mouth, please.
A comment and a question. I mean, the fact that a lot of people call bankers banksters,
Right.
that tells you what the average person thinks of them. And what happens to our Bitcoin when we die? And what if our heirs don't even know we have any
Mm-hmm.
stored? What's the deal?
If it would be the same thing if nobody knew you had it, and if you didn't make arrangements, it'd be the same thing as if you had $100,000 in gold and it went to the bottom of the ocean. In fact, it would actually be harder to retrieve. So the answer is don't do that. Okay, if I got kidnapped by aliens, my son and daughter and loved ones all have instructions, and without even physically being here, can get together and put together the necessary codes and completely not only reconstitute my balance in Bitcoin, but they can reconstitute every transaction I've ever made in that particular wallet that they're redeeming. It's all electronic, and it can be done from anywhere in the world.
Does anybody have any other questions? I have several comments.
And oh, by the way, it goes around probate. Very important point. It doesn't involve any legalities. It just goes. Whoever's got the code has the asset.
So on your deathbed, like minutes before you
Not
expire,
a good time to do it.
you can press a few buttons and just
If I wanted to do
send
that,
everything to your heirs.
I could do that too. But I wouldn't count on that. I would rather have it to where there's a backup strategically located. In fact, it's funny you mention that because I'm writing about that very thing, so that people can safely do that. Now, look for that early next year.
Before Bill leaves, administrivia, could we have a couple of dollars from every participant who contribute to the Libertarian Party of Boulder County? Bob.
Thank you for not eating, Bob.
I had a late breakfast this morning in preparation.
Thank you for
Have a
being
late
here.
lunch.
Yes, thank you all for having me. I
Before you
appreciate it.
leave, Bill, how about a round of applause for Bob?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We're not finished.
Okay.
Because,
Well, I got to go in about 5 minutes, so we got to be
So I'll
getting
go
pretty close.
through this quickly. Over the last year, what has the this goes to Bill? What has been the volatility of Bitcoin?
This year's been it was very, very stable in the 300s up until the spring, and it is currently a little over 600. So that was a phenomenon that happens every 4 years. It's called the halving. A little geeky, a little complicated, but remember, we're still in the early stages of this thing. So kind of like a penny stock, has a lot of up and down. This thing has gone through something kind of like the equivalent of a split.
That's remarkable.
By the way, 2 years ago, on this very day, 2 years ago, Bitcoin was $323 a Bitcoin. Today it is, I think, $610.
After the split, or
Well, it's not really a split, but after the event, after the recent uptick.
okay. And I'll finish this up with you mentioned Bill Buckley and
Yeah,
the first 535
535
people in the phone book.
Right.
I want to object to the alphabetism that he was.
Yeah.
And with that, I'm going to say thank you.
Okay.
Brian, you want to address Bob? Thank you so
Yes.
very much.
Thank you all for having me. I'll see you out. Hopefully, won't be another 2 years. Bye bye now.
And don't.
I'm going to run in front of this.
You have the question.
And I will see you on Amendment 71 things, I'm sure.
Yes.
Okay, good deal.
Do you have a card while
You know, I took a different card today.